Hi, we continue in Luke 8 today with the story of the Gerasene demoniac, picking up in verse 31 where we left off last time, after Jesus asked the man, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," for many demons had entered into him. And today we're just going to go through verse 34 where we encounter pigs, and that'll be an interesting element of the story on the other side of the sea. As I've been doing, as you can see on the right side of the screen, I have the synoptic comparison of Mark, the original, and then Luke, and then Matthew's on the right. And we can see all the differences that Luke has made in the bold sections that he's added to Mark. And you can see the parts that are in bold in Mark that Luke has left out. So we're in this section here, and we'll see there's a number of elements of this that are unique to Luke. And so let's just jump right in. So note, as we saw in the verse before we stopped here, the narrator had said that the man had been driven by the demon, singular, into the wild. And after Jesus asked the name, and he said Legion, now the narrator changes to demons. And we hear that throughout the rest of the section, demons, demons, demons. It's as if the narrator didn't know until Jesus asked and it was revealed, which gives a certain verisimilitude here to the narrator's role, as if the narrator is watching the scene unfold. Luke does a lot of that, especially in Acts of the Apostles, when he gets into the first-person plural approach of it as we, especially in the voyages with Paul. So as we continue through the story, now it's they and plural. And so as we begin here, they begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss, which is a very misleading translation from the New RSV. Mark has out of the country, you see right here. But the Greek here, eisten, abusin, apelthin, does not suggest a return, but a banishment, as my note below says. And almost all translations simply have to go into the abyss. So that's really important here, because it's not as if they were there before. They're begging to go there now. The language of begging here and Jesus' language of permission here is military language. So we could hear this as, even though they're not in direct speech, it's only indirect from the narrator, permission to enter the abyss, sir, and Jesus says permission granted, as fitting for a legion. So why might they do that? They here begged him not to order them, and notice the word for order here is also a command word, and I note some others of those command words throughout, so in a military context, to go into the abyss. Well, I'm not sure what you think of when you hear the abyss, but I've been working on the book of Revelation for a while in this series, and there the abyss is the home of demons. And many scholars assume that's the meaning here, so my note below has apocalyptic reference to spirits imprisoned in the abyss from Jubilees, 1st Enoch, and parts of the New Testament, including Revelation. But that's not the only meaning of abyss, because in the Hebrew Bible, abyss often, or abusos from the Greek, translates the Hebrew to home, which means ocean, which is what led Arnold McConnell, whose piece we looked at last time, to see a connection with Genesis, not only in this scene, but continuing back to the scene of crossing the sea, where Jesus calmed the wind and the water waves, and the disciples asked the question that is shaping this entire section all the way to 950, who is this really who commands the winds and the waves, and they obey him? So Jesus has shown power over the water, and that leads us to hear abyss here, not just as a deep pit like hell or where demons come from, but as deep water. And as an example of that, of how abusos in Greek translates to home in Hebrew many times, let's look at one example here from Psalm 33:7. So we hear here, he gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle, he put the deeps in storehouses. And so you can see their sea in Greek is thalassa, translating the Hebrew yam, but deeps is abusos, translating Hebrew to home. And that's true also in Proverbs and a number of places in Psalms, as well as in Genesis 7 and 8, where it's involved in the flood story. The root meaning of the Greek abuso simply means a very deep place. So it doesn't necessarily imply the bottom of the ocean or a big hole in the earth. It could be either way, any kind of very deep place, implying that humans can't see to the bottom of it, or that it's a hole or a depth that you can't escape out of. But here I want to suggest that it's much more likely to be the water than something like hell. First of all, there's no sense that we know anything about such a concept of hell or abyss like that here, and this is the only use of it in Luke. So Luke doesn't use it that way, and we have no reason to assume he uses it that way. And there's an irony in this. If we hear this as they beg not to be sent into the depth of water, well, of course, they're going to drown. So that's exactly what happens, but only so via the pigs. So let's go back and look at our scene here, and then we'll see how this continues. So the narrator now does something the narrator hasn't done much in this scene, takes a step back and describes the scene here. Now, there was a hillside. On the hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding. Hillside literally is mountains here on the mountain, and we see mountains many times. And as this picture I showed last time, I'll show you it again, looking from the Sea of Galilee out into the hills on the other side. That would certainly make sense that if they were at the top of one of those hills, which is the Decapolis, that the pigs could run down into the sea. But many scholars have noted, as I noted from the map last time, and I'll show you this here, even though this map doesn't show Yesher, which is the current name, ancient Gerasa, was down here somewhere. So plainly, this is not anywhere near the sea. But if we think of the Korah of the Gerasenes, which is how Luke introduces it, and we'll see Parakorah, so the surrounding country, when the people come, we can imagine this entire area of the Decapolis. So it could certainly be somewhere up here rather than down there, which begs the question again of why he mentions Gerasa at the beginning, at the end. And I'd like to hint from what we saw from the work of Kennedy here, that the city of Gerasa would probably be the main imperial place from which the empire would come and go in this region, leading people out in the small towns or in the countrysides to have to defer to them or to resist them, as we saw, because we saw that the question of literacy involved peasant literacy, so-called Sophitic inscriptions, which established in their own sort of coded language a claim to the land, a claim to place. And perhaps the swineherds represent that body as opposed to the people who will come later. So we hear on the hillside a large herd of swine. Some have argued that swine don't travel in herds. Of course, the word herd is the English word. The Greek word here, agale, is used often for camels and sheep. And pigs do travel in groups, although herd isn't the technical term for them, but that's irrelevant for our purpose. They do travel in groups for the same reason other animals do, for mutual protection. So here they are feeding. The word for feeding, baskamene, is basically the same as the word for swineherds that we'll hear a little later, those who are feeding. And again, the demons begged. Notice it's the second time. They begged him not to go into the abyss, and now they beg him to beg Jesus to let them enter the pigs. Why would these people want to enter the pigs? Well, perhaps it feels like home to them, because as a number of scholars have noted, including in a footnote in the article I just showed you, that Matthias Klinghardt argues that the ancient audience would most likely have connected this episode to the occupation by the Roman legion ex frentes, stationed in the first century. And here is the standard, which is to say the banner that they carried into battle with a pig on it. Technically a boar, not a domestic pig, but there it is. So they're wanting to go in the animals that are their very symbol, which of course for an Israelite or later put Jewish audience would be a joke, the unclean animals there, in contrast to the sheep in the beginning of the story. And we'll see that there's quite a parallel between the shepherds conveying their story in chapter 2 positively and the swineherds conveying their story negatively here that leads to everybody being afraid. So the demons begged to be let into the pigs, and he gave them permission granted. And then we have the hilarious scene here. The demons came out of the man, entered the swine. My note there shows simply what I just said. And the herd rushed down the steep bank. Why they're rushing isn't clear. Hormao here, as following Mark, down the steep bank, and again Krimnu here following Mark, into the lake, not following Mark. Mark had the sea, as we've seen throughout here, and were drowned. Or were literally choked, which brings back to the parable of the sower that we saw earlier in this chapter, where thorns and things, translated later in the explanation as anxieties of this world, choke the seed from providing life, and here they're choked by the water. One of the great ironies here is pigs can swim. Take a look. That's from a particular island known as Pig Island, where some feral pigs apparently left from settlers back in the day who were planning to eat them, got away, and they greet visitors there. So pigs definitely can swim. And so the fact they're drowned here is plainly meant to echo the Exodus. And we hear this from Exodus 14:27 and 28. As the Egyptians fled before it, which is to say the waters of the Reed or Red Sea, Yahweh tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. And so, in a similar way, Jesus here takes this branch of the Roman Empire that's cowed all the local people, no pun intended there on cow versus pigs, and he doesn't have to throw them into the sea. They charge directly into the lake and are drowned. So let's go down one more verse here where we meet the swineherds. So when the swineherds saw what had happened, and we have to have to assume that what they see happening is the pigs running down in the sea. That they would not necessarily have seen the man and Jesus talking. Why would they necessarily have seen that? But perhaps they did. Again, the note, as I said, the swineherds, habaskantes, the ones feeding, parallel to the shepherds, we'll look at that more in just a second, saw what had happened. They saw the pigs running into the sea. They ran off and told it in the city and in the country. So they ran off here, and we're seeing running at a couple of places, told it, and we see a number of times of telling. In other words, they're witnessing to what's happened. But notice here, in the city, so it assumes there's a city within running distance. Luke doesn't mention what city it is. And in the country, here, agro, specifically the cultivated land, for the first time here in Luke, and we see it a number of times. So plainly, they're telling it to the elite in the city and the farmers and people like them out in the country, highlighting the division within the area under Roman control, especially between folks who would probably be supporting the Romans and therefore threatened by this symbolic destruction of the legion, and those who may feel like it's a liberation. Much like perhaps when the Babylonians came down to Jerusalem for the exile, the elite saw it as a tragedy, and that's what we see in the texts like Lamentations and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, when their town was destroyed, Jerusalem destroyed, and they end up in Babylon. But for the ordinary people of the land, it was a jubilee. It meant that the debt records were destroyed and they were liberated from their own oppressors who had been subject to the Babylonians. So, as in so many situations, the elite in the city are often distraught when their imperial allies or partners that they've reluctantly or enthusiastically come to an agreement with are threatened, and those in the countryside may find it different. We don't find that out in the story, but we'll look at that next time. So another thing to look at here is the language of movement in this section. So I haven't highlighted all the Greek words, but I've highlighted in bold all the movement. There's so much movement, both in and out of the man, in and out of the water, and all around, which is very interesting, I think, given how few people there are in the scene. It's not until verse 35 that people come out and we see that movement there. I also am just posting here for your benefit, if you haven't seen it before, this is posted on the webpage. If you're not familiar with how Luke uses languages of demons, I'm just noting that this was already posted on the webpage for you to see. And so as the story continues next time, we'll look at how do people respond to this. Are they going to celebrate this liberation and this man who's back, as we'll see, in his right mind after running around naked among the tombs? Or are they going to respond some other way? Stay tuned for that next time. Bye-bye.